what I want to talk about is I want to give you a sort of a philosophical background on the difference between this textbook project, sort of why it's different, and why I got involved. And then I want to show you the clinical teaching model, which is the model of teaching taught at Melbourne University and quite a few different education faculties around the world now, and how the Good Humanities series ticks the boxes when it comes to the clinical teaching cycle. So yeah. I used to be the head of faculty at my school, head of humanities, and so I had one of every single history textbook that you could get for the Australian curriculum. And yeah, must have been about 3 years ago, Catherine Charles Brown, the head of content, came to me and said, are you interested in being part of this author team for this new history textbook? And I said, well, you know, there's like 6 or 7 books out there, and they're all basically, they all do pretty much exactly the same thing. None of them are really doing anything that interesting with, you know, from a pedagogy point of view. And I said, so if you're just going to make another one that's going to be another cookie cutter version like all the other ones out there, I don't see the point, so I'm not really that interested. That sounds really rude, but anyway, so I suggested, because I've got a background in developmental assessment, I worked at a research centre at Melbourne Uni for many years under Patrick Griffin, and he, for a few decades, has been espousing this certain way of thinking about pedagogy and assessment in particular, what I'm dubbing the developmental method, which is basically the idea that learning is developmental rather than some other formulation. And I said, you know, if you want to do it in this different way, then I'm keen. And she went away and came back and said, yes, we're interested in this new approach. And so the biggest thing that you'll see that's different about this book, other than the amazing visual style, is the fact that we've got a learning ladder. And so everything in the book is tied to teaching students a progression, teaching them to get better at certain history and geography skills. So what I first want to do really quickly is just to show you the difference between developmental thinking and standard model thinking. So obviously there's going to be, everyone's sort of on a spectrum between the standard model of thinking and the developmental model of thinking. These are not official terms, these are just terms that I've come up with to kind of describe different pedagogies. Obviously there's kind of an implied criticism about the standard model. Now, that's not to say that I am a completely developmentally minded teacher myself. I think everybody's sort of on a journey. It's what makes teaching so fun, is that it's impossible to be perfect at. So just contrast these two models. So in the standard model, assessment occurs after instruction is complete. So I deliver a lot of PD on assessment, and what we find is that most assessment isn't used to improve teaching, and a lot of it doesn't have that much impact on student outcomes, because you teach, have an assignment, do an assessment, and then move on to something completely different, and you won't necessarily get a chance to teach students those same skills again for maybe a whole year. The developmental model would say that assessment should be happening during instruction or even before instruction, use it to diagnose students' point of readiness and to teach them from that point. Standard model says teachers don't discuss the differences in their teaching strategies. Teaching is a very difficult job, and so a lot of the time the collegiality between staff is basically just to support each other no matter what they're doing. It's not common for teachers to be willing to critique the strategies of other staff based on the results that their students get. This kind of harks back to something that John Hattie talks about, which is the know thy impact. The developmental model, now this is obviously a lot easier said than done, says that teachers should try to improve the teaching ability of each other by querying their teaching strategies, by comparing how well their students are progressing. If one teacher is showing high progress in their students, then the other teacher should think, okay, well, what is it about their teaching style that is transferable to us? This, I think, is very uncommon at the moment. It's very easy to say that we should be going to challenge other teachers' teaching strategies, but ideally that's where the developmental model would like to go. We put students through this same cycle of critique and judgment and improvement, but we don't necessarily do it for ourselves or for each other that much, I don't think. In the standard model, You just teach the whole class at once, explicit teaching from the front, just at one level. If you've got time, you'll help the lower kids, and even less common is offering extension to kids at the top level. The kids at the most able students in Australia, if you look at NAPLAN data, are the ones that make the least progress. Yeah. So teachers have only got a finite amount of time. The government has norms, standards at each year level that say get everybody up to that level. Once you get a kid to that level, then you're going to use your time to try and get as many people up to that level. If students are above that level, then they're kind of left to their own devices to a certain extent. The developmental model would say that you should target teaching as much as possible. Now, obviously, it's impractical to target teaching to say 25 or 30 different students individually, but even if you can have 3, 4 or 5 levels, that's usually sufficient. And in our textbooks, we have 5 levels. The standard model compares students to norms and focuses on what they can't do. So the federal and all the state curriculums are norm-based, so they're based on what is considered the norm for a year 7 or a year 8. And as all of you know, if you've taught for more than 5 seconds, the diversity of ability within any classroom is humongous, and it grows as students go through the year level. So by the time you get to year 10, you're looking at an ability gap of up to 7 years, which, as I'm sure many of you know. The developmental mindset is not interested in norms, it's interested in what students can do and where they're ready to learn. So our existing curriculum is basically norm referenced. We reference it to a norm saying what year 8s should do. The developmental model compares students to criteria, finding out what they can do and then teaching them from that point. It would be lovely if we got to a point where we would have, I worked for the New Zealand Qualifications Authority in NZ when New Zealand brought in criterion referenced senior secondary, so NCEA, students at the end of year 12, instead of getting a kind of meaningless number, rife with judgment, they get a list of statements saying what they can do. And employers have found that much more useful. If they want to put a 17-year-old behind a till, they need to know whether they can follow instructions or whatever, and just a number or a letter can't do that. The standard model, basically, it has what we call deficit thinking. It says everybody needs to be at this certain level, and you've got to fix all of the deficits or the gaps in their knowledge. You often hear people talking about gaps in learning. I really should have had a diagram to explain this, but because all the research suggests that learning is developmental, once you get to a point, and if you don't learn this, but you're not really going to learn this stuff very much at all. So assessment is used to find out where people are and teach them at that point. It's not a case of just going and looking for the, disparate gaps that they have in their knowledge. Essentially, you find out where they stopped learning and teach them from that point. Just a quick word about formative and summative assessment. Anytime I talk, I just like to briefly mention this because I think there's quite a big misunderstanding about these terms. Assessment itself is not formative or summative. I can give the exact same assessment and it could be formative if I use it in one way, or it could be summative if I use it in another one. So for example, if I had a geography test and I give it to students on the last day of the year, I mark it, give them a mark out of 100, they go on holidays. That's me using it summatively. That's me using that assessment as a summation of what they've learned. If I gave the exact same test at the start of the unit or in the middle of the unit and used it to say, oh, okay, most of my students already know about volcanoes, don't need to teach that, that would be using the assessment formatively. So the assessment itself is not summative or formative, it's what you do with the evidence. So just a tiny little point there. The title of the book that my old boss, Patrick, edited is called Assessment is for Teaching, and he thinks that the most useful use of assessment is to improve the way we teach. Back in the day, there used to just be content. Content was king, and so teachers would lift up the lids of students' heads and pour it full of content and close the lid and off they go to get a job in the mines or whatever. Now there's been a move to including, there's now like content and skills paired up, but there's also, and that's what got that on here, there's also a move now towards these soft skills capabilities. So I just want to talk about all three of them really briefly and how they relate to the developmental mindset. There's this there's this sort of false, the straw man argument about, content versus skills and how much weighting should we put towards both. And it used to just be all content, and now the pendulum's shifted towards skills. The fact of the matter is you can't teach students skills if they don't have content knowledge first. Teaching skills in a vacuum is not possible. And it's the same with capabilities. The idea, I was only recently convinced of this the last couple of years, but the idea of trying to teach creative thinking in a vacuum without any content knowledge is really, really difficult. Is content used developmentally? Basically, it's how you use that knowledge. So developmental thinking wouldn't have a whole heap to say about how much knowledge you've got. They'd say, well, how much knowledge do you need to do something with it? So you might not need that much knowledge just to list a few facts, but if you were evaluating a solution to a geographical problem or evaluating Australia's involvement in World War I or whatever, then you would need to have a whole lot more content knowledge. So the amount of content knowledge that you've got in terms of developmental thinking, Bloom's taxonomy, is just what you use, how much knowledge you need to use it in certain ways. Skills. So I find, because most people say that they enjoy learning by doing, skill-based activities are probably the most engaging for students. They're also the most transferable. Just to give you an example from history, you think about what I would say are probably the three most transferable skills, transferable to other academic areas and also life in general: observation, writing, and research. And those skills that are developed by history students big time, and they can use them in other areas. Interestingly, even though writing and research, I think, are probably the two main things that actual historians do, you don't see it mentioned in the Victorian curriculum. But we have included in the book because we're so awesome. And the developmental approach is probably most easily applicable to skills. So the taxonomies that you'd be thinking of in that instance would be Dreyfus, Solo, stuff like that. Laser. Capabilities, as mentioned, these are those soft skills, the 4 C's. You'll often hear them talked about. That's the new buzzword: communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity. The thing is, basically, the reason why these are getting focused on these days is because the pace of change in modern society is so great that a student coming into prep at the moment is going to graduate in like 2034. What's the world going to look like in 2034? We have no idea. So we try to, so it's important to, give students capabilities to deal with whatever's going to be around in 2034. It's like how I tried to get my school to teach typing, and they said, because I learned typing at school, probably the most useful work skill I've ever learned. And my school didn't want to, because I said by the time these kids graduated, it'll all be voice dialing anyway, which is probably true. So why do we have developmental thinking as a philosophical background to the Good Humanities series? A couple of different reasons. The first one, it develops a growth mindset in students. The focus on everybody being somewhere on this learning ladder and just slowly getting better helps students to understand progress and to see that everyone can progress, rather than obsessing about fixed things like grades. Another reason is that student motivation goes up quite a lot. We've introduced developmental thinking at my school over the last 4 or 5 years, and what we've found is that there's a huge increase in student motivation, particularly for those students at the bottom and at the top of the ability spectrum. Students at the bottom often find, they're working their butts off and it's not reflected in their grades, and so they get demotivated. Students at the top find it easy to get A's, and so they don't push themselves. With the developmental rubric as kind of like the structure of the domain of knowledge, students can see what it looks like to get better, and students at the bottom level know that they're making progress through this learning ladder or rubric, whatever you want to call it. And the reason why the motivation increases the most for the people at the bottom and at the top is because our curriculum is all based around this middle 30% who the age-based norms are relevant to. If you think about, what the statements say about what year 8 should be able to do, if you think about your class, it's probably only true for about 25–30% of them. They just happen to be in the middle of this bell curve, and so for some reason they're given special status. Developmental thinking is also about progress, not achievement. So this kind of links back to the growth mindset stuff. Demonstrating to students that they're making progress is way more important than finding out, than labeling them with their current achievement level. And finally, I think a really important thing that we teachers want to do is to turn our students into lifelong learners, because then we'll be in their heads forever. So we find that developmental thinking hopefully promotes lifelong learning much more than the standard model. So the background for developmental thinking is we have developmental rubrics. So these are rubrics written according to the rules developed at the Assessment Research Centre at Melbourne Uni, where I was going to say used to work, but I'm working with them again. Anyway, so this is a history example, and here's a geography example. And these are very, very similar to the learning ladders, which are in our books, which I'll show you in a minute, and which are also, fun coincidence, very similar to the new 2022 History VCE performance descriptors, which I also wrote. So now I'm just going to run you through the clinical teaching cycle and show you the stages, and then match that up with what happens in the Good Humanities books. So before teaching, ideally you do a pre-assessment to find out what students' current ability level is, so that you could use it for ability-based grouping, targeted teaching, whatever you might want to use it for. Targeting by ability. Fun fact, I'm going to write myself a note to find the reference to this one. I read, I can't remember where it was a few years ago, that roughly 80% of what students see is too hard or too easy. And you get some real classroom management problems when the work that students are doing is too easy, they get bored, too hard, they get frustrated, and then they start playing up. So if you can target the material that your students are accessing match their ability with the difficulty of the work that they're doing, then they enter this state which in educational psychology is called flow. That's where we all want to get to. Yep, so target by ability. Another way to think about using diagnostic assessment is to find the Goldilocks zone, not too, not too hard, not too easy. This is a very strange story. I was thinking about Goldilocks the other day. Like, how often do you find kids wandering into strangers' houses? And anyway, and targeting by ability. So once you know a student's ability, you can use it to make ability-based groups. You could also use it for mixed ability groups. Both have a really important purpose, and they have different purposes, obviously. I think this is the elephant in the room. You often hear, I've been to PDs where people say differentiation can be anything. Differentiation is using lots of colors in your PowerPoints, or going outside or whatever. And I would argue that those things are all just interesting teaching, and the most meaningful use of the term differentiation in education is differentiation based on student ability. Just really quickly, I haven't got time to go through this in detail, but what we find is that there's not enough extension in Australian education. Teachers find it difficult to extend students, particularly because, especially for humanities, it's the #1 taught out of field subject in the whole country. And so if you're not, if you don't breathe history and geography, then you're going to struggle to extend students with it. But there are some principles of extension there. One criticism of differentiation by ability, which I've heard time and time again, is that it puts too much of a workload on teachers. You essentially would need to write, the argument is that you would need to write a lesson plan for every single student in the class, and that's too much workload, so can't do it, get rid of it, even if it might be beneficial. However, if you can plan in teams and share that planning, then you can come up with a number of activities linked to different levels. And I'm just giving you a real quick example here of how it could be done. So this is the learning ladder for our Year 7 and 8 history textbook. There's 5 skills at 5 different levels of difficulty. It would be too hard for one teacher to plan 25 different activities to do in a class. What do? Say you've got 5 teachers in your teaching team. They each write a targeted activity at one level. So let's say, and I know because I've done heaps of these, let's say, for example, it took you half an hour to create an activity targeted at the level. And let's apply this to every single level, blah, blah, blah. Loving the PowerPoint animations, and what you find out is that in a team of 5 teachers, if they're willing to put in 2.5 hours of work over a year or whatever, then you will have this bank of targeted activities. I haven't been that successful at getting shared planning happening in my own school, so I did it all myself, and there's an example of a large composite rubric which has activities, targeted activities for geography, and this is for students from probably about year 5 level up to, some of these top ones would be first year university type stuff. Obviously an important teaching strategy is modelling, which is the I do, we do, you do thingy. It's a really good idea to get students to record their own progress. This is something that I've started doing in the last few years, and it's been really, really, really probably the most impactful thing that I've introduced in my teaching in the last 5 years. Is basically I get students to glue a massive rubric in the back of their book. That is how we're going to do for the whole semester. We do a semester of history and a semester of geography. And then I do a little pre-assessment. I can show you one. I've been marking them this morning. So this is what I get them to glue in the back of their book. I get them to do a little 2-page pre-assessment, and I assess their starting ability level on all these different skills. And then every time we do another activity using these skills or an assessment, they can mark off their own progress, and everybody. So it kind of takes the judgment out of it. I'm not labeling anybody A, B, C, D, or E. I'm just saying you are somewhere on this learning ladder, and we want you to go up. And everyone is somewhere on that ladder. I might just skip this one. This was really confusing when I explained it the other day. This is Hattie and Timperley's 2010 article about the 4 levels of feedback. So if you know anything about that, they suggest that self-regulation is the best level to direct your feedback at. Anyway, something that's very frustrating is that you give students amazing feedback and you give them the grade at the same time, and they look at the grade and then they look at everyone else in the class, and everybody does the eyes like, I got better than you, or oh no, I got worse than you. And they ignore all of the written feedback that you've given them. So if you don't make them respond to the feedback, there's no point. So I've weaned my students off getting the grade. So once they complete an assignment, I give them the rubric. They have to fill this little puppy out here, and it's only once they've done that that I'll give them the mark. So I know, and when they're doing another assignment using the same skills, I'll actually have them hold up what they reflected on last time. So much of the feedback that we give to students is wasted because A, they don't respond to it, and B, they're not reminded about what they supposedly learned last time when they use that skill next time. Just as an aside, self and peer assessment is really, really powerful. What I usually do now on all the assessments that I create is I stick the assessment rubric on it, and once they complete the assignment, I get them to mark themselves, and then I can look at how they went and how I marked it, and if there's a discrepancy, which there usually is, we can, that is the start of a really interesting conversation. Why did you think that you analysed, but I said that you were only describing? And then at the end, you have a final skill display. That might be an assignment or whatever. That can act as a post-assessment, and you can assess them against a learning ladder or whatever. And in geography, you often see that as fieldwork. So that was the clinical model of teaching. There it is there. So how does good humanities use developmental thinking? Let's talk about that. So firstly, here are the developmental rubrics that we've got. So this is the one, this is the history one, 5 skills at 5 steps, and this is the geography one. Now, just looking at that rubric alone contains quite a lot of teaching in it. It tells students what it looks like to get better. The kids who find it quite easy to get my laser pointer out here. The kids who, usually doing really good and can get this level, they've never been told what it looks like to get better. They've never been told that not only should you be using data to support your claims, you should be evaluating the data. You should be questioning whether or not that data is valid, blah, blah, blah. So even just within the rubric itself, there's quite a lot of learning. Before teaching, as mentioned, we said that you should do a pre-assessment. The online material, we provide a pre-assessment for every single chapter. We've got 2 forms of pre-assessment. We've got a pre-test, which just gives students a number, and then they do that same test at the end to see how much they improved. And then we have a qualitative assessment, like this one, just like a little quick 2-pager. And that's the one that I would give out at the start of the whole unit, and I would mark them against a rubric like I was showing you earlier. So we've got one of them for every single chapter. Now, the book itself, all of the questions in it are linked to the learning ladder. So on the left here, you'll see we've got the learning ladder for history. On the right is a screenshot of a typical chapter. So the first questions are linked to step 1, second step linked to step 2, third step linked to step 3, the fourth step linked to step 4. Now, you can choose whether you want students to practice those skills at all 4 levels, or you might decide, I just want this group of students just to do the step 4, and then the step 5 gets done in the masterclass, which I'll show you a screenshot of in a sec. Here we go. We include extension within the book. It's not an add-on. It's not something that you need to do something fiddly online with. At the end of every chapter, there's a masterclass where students get the opportunity to demonstrate all 5 skills at all 5 levels, including that top level. Now, shared planning. So this is just, unfortunately, this goes a little bit too quickly, but in our discussions with teachers and looking at the stats, we've found that humanities is the #1 taught at a field subject in the country, and so you have a lot of teachers who are not trained in teaching history or geography. So for every single chapter, and I wrote a lot of these, there's a lot of work went into it, you've got like a 30 or 40 page document that has got a lesson plan for every single lesson. Not only does it have a lesson plan for every single lesson, but these are called work programs. They're divided up into sections, and you can mix and match which things you like. It gives you quite a lot of tips about interesting teaching strategies. So there's an introduction activity, the main learning activity, an interesting way to use the textbook, something a little bit out of the ordinary, because not everybody wants to just get students to read it. You might, photocopy it, chop it up into bits and get them to reorder it, or do a tag CEDO or whatever, a word cloud. There's also homework suggestion, an extension activity suggestion, and a remediation. So these work programs contain not just lesson plans, but also like ideas for lessons that you could use elsewhere. We've also got, so in terms of modelling, in the middle of the book, there's a history how-to section. You flip it over, there's a geography how-to section, and this is worked examples at every single level for every single skill. So just quickly, there's an example of chronology. There's step 1, step 2, and it goes all the way up. We've also, as mentioned, got explicit teaching of history writing. So rather than doing it at 5 levels of proficiency, because you could have a whole heap of skills just for writing, for the writing and the research, we've gone here, what's the 5 steps in the historical writing or research cycle. So the history writing cycle is identifying the writing purpose. Here we're teaching kids even at year 7 what the command verbs mean that they'll need in VCE. There we go, all the way up to, sentence starters, drafting tips. We were quite proud of this because I don't think I've ever seen explicit the teaching of history writing this explicitly in any history textbook that I've ever seen. Even proofreading tips, and then we do the historical research. So this is the 5 stages in historical research: defining a problem, blah blah blah, and there's even like tips for Googling and stuff like that. And obviously there's the same for geography as well. PQE, we've got sheet analysis, sketching, and a whole heap more. In terms of students recording their progress, we've just developed this really cool little booklet called My Learning Pathway. It's just a 4-page booklet. You can print it out as A3 and fold it over, and students track their own progress. So they would record how they went on the pre and post test. They do a brainstorm before and after learning about the unit, and there's a whole heap of other things as well. They would shade in this little building based on which activities that they've done in the book. And then they can record how they went on the little chapter quizzes there. And then on this page, they can record how often they practiced skills at different levels. And then for the history My Learning Pathway, they slowly fill out a timeline as they learn more about it. And for the geography My Learning Pathways, there's an infographic that they fill in as they learn about that topic. The final skill display as a capstone project, so we get students to do a capstone where they can, and this can be assessed against the learning ladder. So you can use the pre-assessment and the capstone, and you'll be able to measure the effect that you as a teacher are having, and you can students will be able to measure their own progress. Yeah, and that's done with fieldwork. So in terms of the clinical model, let me just skip through this. I'm 3 seconds over my half an hour here. So in green is where the Good Humanities books come in to help you with the clinical model. So pre-assessments, work programs for suggestions for teaching strategies, and the capstone project to see what happened, see whether or not your teaching was successful. Finally, I just want to mention the link to VCE that we've got in the history books. So there's a little table in the book for the year 10s that show what, so if you have a look down here, these are all the skills that you need for VCE history, and this is where in our books you learn it. I just want to show you the similarity, because one thing that I often hear is, oh, yep, these developmental rubrics are lovely, Ben, love them, but, you know, I teach VCE history, and in VCE history, we don't mark using that system. Well, the good news is that is all changing, because here is the 2022 Revolutions performance descriptors developed by me and the infamous Jerry Martin from VCAA. Our real labour of love these things. Probably took us about 2 years to develop them, and if you are familiar with the existing performance descriptors, these are very different, and these are written according to the same rules developed at Melbourne Uni that I used to write these learning letters. And that is all. That's the end of my rant.